Welcome back to educator.com. Today we're going to go over the final lecture of this series, and it deals with public policy. So let's get right down to this lecture here. In today's lecture, what we're going to do, we're going to identify areas in which the federal government has taken more control of domestic public policy, and that's been the trend over the course of the 20th century, in which the federal government has actually taken a lead role in a lot of public policy issues. More specifically, we're going to describe key provisions of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Now, again, a lot of the provisions actually have recently kicked in. So on the AP test, this might or might not show up, but again, this is actually part of what's happening in government. So again, as things continue to take place, things tend to be updated. We're going to understand the shift of the role of government that occurred during the middle of the 20th century. We're going to differentiate between fiscal and monetary policy. We're going to explain why current economic public policy in regards to Social Security might threaten America's fiscal future. And finally, we're going to discuss possible ways in which Social Security reform might be achieved. So we're going to talk a lot about economics and fiscal monetary policy, the solvency of Social Security in the future. While these topics are discussed in the AP government curriculum, really you don't really need to have an in-depth knowledge of it, but it definitely is to your advantage to be well versed in this. And questions do come up regarding Social Security and taxes. But again, you don't really have to know it at an extremely deep level. That being said, it absolutely is to your advantage to know this. This might be the reason why you might get a 5 instead of that 4 if you master the areas of economic public policy. So in terms of domestic policy, what are certain things that the federal government controls? One might be crime prevention. And a lot of it has to do with gun control. The federal government has taken steps to enact laws limiting gun ownership or making it more difficult to get gun ownership. Basically, after Reagan's assassination attempt in 1981, federal laws have made gun crimes more harsh. So again, public policy has tilted towards giving more control of gun issues to the federal government. Again, something that is relatively new when compared to history of the United States. President Clinton actually signed the Brady Bill, which requires a 5-day waiting period and background check before a gun purchase. And not only that, there's been an increase in bureaucratic authority in following executive and legislative mandates. For example, the FBI, the DEA, ATF, these agencies have been given more discretionary authority in implementing a lot of these executive mandates or legislative mandates, so to speak. So again, a lot of federal bureaucratic control is been given to the government over the past however many years. Also, in the realm of education, President Bush actually became, he decided to use this as a bipartisan effort. So when he chose to run for president, he actually focused on education as something that Republicans and Democrats could actually agree upon. Now, this was a measure of extra federal spending and government control, maybe something later on that conservatives didn't like about President Bush, but this is something that President Bush was able to reach across the aisle to Democrats in order to get them signed off on something regards to public policy. Clearly, there are a lot of different disagreements, but in terms of No Child Left Behind, President Bush signed into law, and Senator Ted Kennedy actually worked with George Bush in pushing education reform through Congress. So as far as education, the federal government basically has increasingly taken a role in what has traditionally been a state issue. But again, the trend towards public policy is that the federal government's taking a lead role in a lot of these issues. Again, fairly recently, in 1979, Congress created the Department of Education under President Jimmy Carter. And one of the things that President Reagan tried to do early on was campaign for the actual, trying to dismantle the Department of Education. But by the time it had been created, again, just like any bureaucracy, it'd been to a point where it's very difficult to try to dismantle something once the ball has gotten started rolling. So President Reagan was unsuccessful in trying to dismantle the department, and he kind of backed off the stance of too much government control in terms of education. And again, as I mentioned before, President Bush, along with Senator Ted Kennedy, they worked together, and President Bush eventually signed into law in 2002 the No Child Left Behind Act, which basically mandated a lot of federal standards in education, and the term of unfunded mandate, where the president or Congress, federal government mandates certain things, but they don't provide the states the money to actually follow through on it. No Child Left Behind basically was an example of a bunch of unfunded mandates where the government added new regulations, and there's a lot of these mandates that weren't funded, and states were responsible for implementing a lot of these new regulations. Now, in terms of health public policy, one of the biggest topics since Obama has become elected president is the issue of Obamacare. Now, one of the things that actually came about in terms of the nickname Obamacare, obviously it's because one of the things that President Obama, at that time Senator Obama, campaigned on, but during his re-election campaign, Mitt Romney actually referred to Obamacare and asked Obama whether it's something that he was okay with, and President Obama basically accepted that terminology. It had been used ever since it was passed, but basically what was a pejorative term that a lot of conservatives use when they refer to Obamacare as a term for describing federal intrusion into matters that traditionally have been left to individuals and states. Basically, Obamacare, Democrats and supporters of Obamacare, they refer to Obamacare in a sharply different manner. So again, there's a lot of partisan undertones when the term Obamacare is used. But again, it can actually be used in a very neutral term, in a very Republican, conservative way of demeaning federal intrusion into healthcare, or it can be a way to talk about how Obama was able to get a measure of national healthcare as part of the agenda, being able to expand healthcare access to millions more Americans. But the actual name is actually the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, or the Affordable Care Act. So this was the actual act that was passed through Congress, and it was actually signed into law. It was signed into law by President Barack Obama on March 23rd, 2010. Now, what did it include? It included mandates, subsidies, and insurance exchanges aimed at expanding public and private health coverage. A lot of the popular measures of Obamacare was introduced early on. For example, individuals that were 25 and under were now permitted to be part of their parents' health insurance coverage, and a very popular popular measure for those that had pre-existing conditions. It prevented insurers from denying coverage to individuals with pre-existing conditions. So a lot of these popular measures were basically like front-loaded as part of the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of the more unpopular provisions were slowly rolled out, including the individual mandate that basically requires individuals to sign up for health insurance or pay a penalty. And so that was actually rolled out here. Individuals are required to have health care coverage or a fine levied. Now, there are exceptions if you don't meet certain income requirements, and there are subsidies in place if you aren't able to afford it. But the deadline actually was March 31st of 2014, basically stating that if you did not have coverage, if you did not have coverage starting from that date, then you didn't meet the requirements of Affordable Care Act. And the reason being is that if you had a over a 3-month gap in terms of coverage, then you would be required to pay the fine under new regulations. So that's why the goal of the administration was to get 7 million signed up through the federal exchanges, and one of the successes that Obama and Obamacare supporters were able to proclaim was that yes, by the time April 1st rolled around, they had their total of 7 million that signed up through the exchanges. But at the same time, there are a lot of failures in terms of rolling it out. There's a lot of issues with the website not working out, and actually, as a result, the Department of Health and Human Services, led by Catherine Sebelius, she actually ended up submitting her resignation, and so there were some successes, but even Democrats would admit to the fact that the way that Obamacare was rolled out to the public, it was done perhaps in a very partisan way, and there's a lot of glitches that came about as a result of what was rolled out with Obamacare. Now, a huge challenge of Obamacare that was overcome was in terms of the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate. It was actually upheld by the Supreme Court in June of 2012, and it was seen as a victory for Obama. But at the same time, the reasoning was actually kind of interesting, and who actually sided with the majority, that was actually something that to a lot of political observers was pretty surprising. So it wasn't Congress's necessary and proper or Commerce Clause that the administration argued that was the reason why the government had the ability to mandate health coverage. And so it was a defeat in that regard. But Congress's power to tax was actually upheld with Chief Justice John Roberts, who actually aligned with the liberals on the court, and basically he wrote the majority opinion saying that the government had the ability to issue an individual mandate because the alternative was not a penalty, but rather a tax. And so the language of what was allowed and disallowed actually kind of changed because of Supreme Court's ruling. So President Obama originally had insisted that there would be no new taxes to come about as a result of Obamacare, and that it would actually raise money. But basically, the term that Obamacare was now levying a tax to those that did not enroll in healthcare, it became part of the conversation rather than Obamacare was imposing a penalty or a fine. For all intents and purposes, it's the exact same thing, but the wording actually became kind of interesting. And again, it became a matter that the Supreme Court actually stepped in and determined the constitutionality of Obamacare. Now, social welfare, again, a big hot topic issue in terms of what is the extent that the government should be involved in. But basically, the public attitude towards more government involvement, fighting against economic downturns and poverty, it shifted somewhat during the Great Depression, meaning that individuals started expecting the government, especially in the age of radio and television, the idea of an activist approach to government became very popular. Franklin Roosevelt was very good with that. Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge, he didn't do a whole lot, and he had more of a laissez-faire approach to governing. That didn't play too well, and so Franklin Roosevelt's style of enacting government reforms and having the government involved, for better or for worse, that became the norm in the 20th century. And once that shift in public attitude was made, it became very difficult to kind of undo it. So even with a lot of the reforms that President Reagan made and his conservative revolution, he didn't eliminate Social Security. He didn't eliminate Medicare. He just cut down the size and scope of a lot of federal bureaucracy. But again, once you create institutions, once you create organizations, then it becomes very difficult to dismantle them. So the Social Security Act of 1935 was created under FDR, and later on Medicare under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s was established. And so basically it put much more federal control of domestic policy than ever before. And again, not surprisingly, very predictably, today two of the biggest government expenditures are Social Security and Medicare, and we'll discuss that a little bit further in the next couple slides. But again, in the 1980s, Reagan sharply reduced benefits and effectively used a lot of rhetoric decrying big government. So to a certain degree, he was successful in reducing the scope of welfare and reducing a lot of programs, cutting wasteful spending. But a lot of what Reagan talked about was just political rhetoric to energize his conservative base. And again, a lot of the things that he had set out to do, he didn't necessarily do. But again, one of the Reagan's most famous quotes was that government isn't the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. Again, the idea that more federal government control isn't the answer to solving economic problems. And in the 90s, Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress under Newt Gingrich ended welfare as we know it, basically replacing the existing welfare program, AFDC, which was an acronym for Aid for Families with Dependent Children, which is basically more of a permanent structure. And what this did was it created perverse incentives for individuals to not work, and by having more kids, getting more welfare. So there clearly some need, and obviously there are individuals that were not wanting to be on welfare, but circumstances dictated that they were on welfare. But there was a lot of abuse in the system, and again, there's a lot of lack of incentives of getting off of government support. So again, it turned into basically from an entitlement program to basically more of a temporary workfare type program. And again, TANF, which was an acronym for Temporary Aid for Needy Families, became more of a block grant that was administered by states. So there was a significant amount of welfare reform that was accomplished in the Clinton presidency and under Newt Gingrich's leadership as Speaker of the House that basically ended welfare as we know it. So there is government assistance, but now a lot of the welfare programs are administered through the states, and definitely not as a permanent fixture as it had been under AFDC. So in terms of economic public policy, very simple, again, very basic definitions. You're not going to have to know a lot of terms with expansionary monetary policy or expansionary fiscal policy and the impact and drawing graphs. Those topics are more for the AP macroeconomics course, which is also on educator.com. But for the tools required to pass the AP government exam are basic terms on what is fiscal policy, what is monetary policy, what is the state of Social Security, how does the government raise most of its income. These are very basic questions. There's no intense graphs that you really have to draw yourself. Now, one of the things that is required is being able to interpret data, but again, being able to do complicated economic graphs, that's not part of the AP government course, but knowing the terminology is absolutely crucial. So government raises revenue through a variety of taxes. So there's, again, a couple of different sources. There's individual income taxes. There's corporate income taxes that businesses pay. There's social insurance taxes, which is Social Security and Medicare. And then there's estate and gift taxes. So estate taxes are basically administered to wealthier individuals when they die. A certain percentage of that, of the value of their estate is actually given to the government. And basically to avoid situations where individuals skirt the estate tax, there's also a gift tax that taxes any gifts to individuals above a certain amount of income. So again, the government raises revenues for a variety of sources, but ultimately, individual income tax is the primary source of revenue for the government, even though 47% of people pay no federal income tax. The reason why I say 47%, that number actually became very popular in the election of 2012. Mitt Romney, in a speech to conservatives that he didn't realize was being recorded, and that eventually aired unfavorably towards him, he had mentioned that 47% of Americans pay no federal income tax. And what he said was actually absolutely true. About 47%, again, varies each year, but 47% of taxpayers pay no income tax. Now, they do pay other taxes. They pay social insurance taxes, Social Security, Medicare, sales tax, all these different taxes, but the primary source of revenue from the government comes from the 53% of taxpayers that are liable for income taxes. The reason why 47% of people don't pay federal income taxes is because we have a progressive tax structure in which, as you allow for certain deductions and credits, it takes away federal tax liability. And so 47% Americans in lower wage jobs, or maybe even mid-paying jobs, if you own a house, if you have a family of 4 or 5, if you contribute a lot of money to charity, it's possible that you're not liable for any federal income taxes. So again, as a matter of economic public policy, the United States, they gain their primary source of income through individual income taxes, again, usually from upper income individuals, and the IRS is in charge of enforcing that. Now, as far as monetary policy, it's the Federal Reserve Board that controls monetary policy through the Federal Open Market Committee. Now, as far as monetary policy is concerned, if you have to define monetary policy, it's a use of interest rates to keep unemployment and inflation stable. So again, it's a Federal Reserve Board that's in charge of creating monetary policy, or altering or making decisions in regards to that. And again, the Fed chairman is a post that is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. Now, the Fed chairman exerts a lot of power in his or her ability to implement monetary policy as opposed to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the use of taxes and government spending to influence real GDP, whereas monetary policy is the use of changing interest rates, either the discount rate, the federal funds rate. Again, changing things a little bit more immediately. Fiscal policy is a little bit more difficult just because of the process of getting the president and Congress to agree on something. That's infinitely more difficult than getting an unelected group of officials led by the Fed chair to build a consensus on the direction of the federal funds rate. So again, monetary and fiscal policy, there definitely are differences. They're used in conjunction with one another to try to keep the economy stable. Now again, who are some notable Fed chairmen that have actually served? Fed chairs during the 70s, early 80s, a guy by the name of Paul Volcker. He raised interest rates or the federal funds rate, and during inflationary times, that's sometimes the medicine that's required. He is given credit for stabilizing high inflation when inflation even crept into the double digits. And he was able to basically induce a recession, which in the short term was fairly painful, but basically was able to get the economy back under control by raising interest rates. And then you had Alan Greenspan, who was pretty much the Fed chairman through most of the 80s and early 90s, was nicknamed the Maestro because of his ability to maintain low inflation and low unemployment. His reputation became much more marred as the housing collapse of 2008 basically left the economy in shambles, and a lot of blame, not the only blame, but a lot of blame was pinned on the Fed chairman for his inability to forecast something along those lines. Because this easy monetary policy of lowered interest rates and easy money created a bubble in the housing market. And then you had Ben Bernanke. He was the one that actually had to deal with the Great Recession in 2008. And again, his legacy is again still yet to be determined. He did a lot of lowering of the federal funds rate and using a lot of unconventional tools, basically a lot of unprecedented tools to deal with the financial crisis. And most recently, for the first time, a female Fed chair was appointed by Janet Yellen. And again, from all indications, Janet Yellen has basically continued a lot of the dovish policies of Ben Bernanke, basically doing whatever is possible to try to get employment back to where unemployment is closer to the 6%, 5% mark. So again, there's a lot of specifics that you could definitely learn about in terms of economic policy. But as far as this AP government exam is concerned, make sure you understand what fiscal policy is, dealing with government spending and taxes, and what monetary policy is, changing of interest rates, buying and selling of government bonds, and who controls what policy. Fiscal policy is controlled jointly by Congress and the president, whereas monetary policy is controlled by the FOMC, and the head of the FOMC is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, currently Janet Yellen. And so there are two different types of spending in terms of what the government can spend its money on. And it's generally two broad categories. There's mandatory and discretionary spending. So these two types of government spending, first of all, mandatory spending refers to the money that is spent based on existing laws for current programs. So unless the law is changed, basically Congress is under compulsion to basically make payments. So that's why it's referred to as mandatory spending. Now, what is troubling about American public policy is that a lot of this mandatory spending is increasingly becoming a bigger and bigger part of the overall spending. Whereas mandatory spending might have only been maybe like 30 or 40% at one time in American history. Now mandatory spending is increasingly becoming 70, 75%, maybe even 80% of the total federal budget, which means that lawmakers, their hands are pretty much tied, even if they cut a lot of pork barrel spending, even if they cut the amount of money given to the post office, whatever it may be, because current laws require certain spending on Social Security, Medicare, or unemployment based on entitlements, unless there's some type of entitlement reform, there's not going to be a whole lot of reduction in spending. Now, what are these examples of mandatory spending? Well, you have interest payments on the national debts, which currently is around 17 trillion, give or take a couple trillion. I mean, what's a couple trillion? I mean, I find a couple $1 trillion and change in my couch, every other day. But yeah, these are huge expenses. And basically the loans that basically we were able to take out as a country, every month, interest payments are going to have to be made on the loans that have already been taken out. So there's over $17 trillion in debt that the United States has, which begs the question, is it even possible for America to get out of debt? But again, that's an issue for a definitely interesting class. But again, just being aware of America's fiscal condition would be useful for this exam. Again, Medicare payments. It represents about 2.9% of income, which is split between the employer and employee. What that means is that an individual who gets a paycheck, they're only taxed 1.5% of their income, which goes towards Medicare, whereas the employer is also charged 1.45%, and they pay it on behalf of their employee. Now, one of the kind of hidden things of Obamacare was that for those individuals making over a certain amount, $250,000, they're paying an additional amount. So it's kind of a hidden tax of Obamacare. Social Security, 12.4% of income goes to Social Security, which is again split between the employer and employee. So employer pays 6.2%, and the employee pays 6.2% as well. Now, if you're a self-employed business, you would be responsible for paying both the employer and the employee, and the same thing with Medicare. So if you're self-employed, not only are you liable for federal and state income taxes, you are liable for the payroll tax as well, of which you're paying the entire 12.4% for Social Security, and you're paying the entire 2.9% for Medicare. So it's very expensive to get into business, given that Social Security and Medicare, the first 15.3% of your income goes towards these payroll taxes. So it can be fairly intimidating getting into business on your own because of the tax aspect to it. Now, since 2010, Social Security has been running a cash deficit. So more money is being paid out to retirees than are coming in from workers. And again, as the baby boomer generation, as they're retiring, then you're going to have more people leaving the workforce and collecting Social Security. And as demographic trends have made it so that people are having less kids, marrying later, then you're going to have a very simple population issue, something that has affected Japan and growth in their economy, as there are more and more older people that enter the population and draw from Social Security. You have less and less workers going into the workforce, and so the amount of money that's being paid out in Social Security is going to only get worse as less money is coming in and more money is going out. And again, the problem with this here is that discretionary spending, again, spending which government planners can make choices in how to allocate funds, such as defense, education, scientific research, foreign aid, disaster aid, again, anything that's not mandatory, that's becoming increasingly smaller and smaller percentage of overall spending. In fact, at a certain point, it is theoretically possible that all the spending, or 90% of the spending that is made, could end up being based on mandatory spending rather than discretionary. So what are some possible ways to reform Social Security? So what are certain things that, if you're a politician, if you had the support from members of possibly both sides of the aisle, what are some possible reform measures? And I'm sure there's several, but three that I can come up with right now that might work would be: one, raise Social Security taxes; two could be reduce benefits to current or future retirees; or three is raise the retirement age. So there's three possible ways that you can look to try to solve the Social Security problem, and we'll go through possible pros and cons of each of these alternatives. Raising Social Security taxes, reducing benefits to either current or future retirees, or raising the retirement age. Now again, raising Social Security taxes, that's a form of fiscal policy, something that Congress and the President jointly control. But basically, it's extremely unpopular form of fiscal policy, especially during recessionary times. Any increase in taxes is going to spark backlash amongst people, because that's the tax that most individuals are affected by immediately the most. And there's a lot of individuals that pay more Social Security taxes than they do federal income taxes. So if you raise taxes on Social Security, you can argue that it's a tax on the poor and working class. And so that's not going to be very popular from a political standpoint. Actually, in fact, in 2011 and 2012, during the recovery from the Great Recession, Congress not only did not raise Social Security taxes, actually lowered the FICA tax to 4.2% for employees. And again, it's something that's since been raised back to that 6.2% to employees. But again, what that served to do was it increased the Social Security deficit, because when you lower the amount of taxes that are coming in, the revenues are actually decreasing. And again, more people are retiring, and they are being given benefits. And again, it's one thing to project an amount of benefits, but you don't know exactly how much Social Security is going to go out in any given year, but you can make a pretty good estimate. And again, the trend is that unless there is some entitlement reform, the numbers simply don't add up. The amount of money that's going in is going to be much less than the money that's actually going out. One other way is to reduce benefits to current or future retirees. But you're going to get strong opposition from senior citizens who vote more often than any other age groups. As a politician, if your goal is to get reelected, which is a legitimate goal for most politicians, and they want to act as a delegate, they represent the interests of their constituents, well, they're probably going to try to represent the interests of their constituents who vote. And so individuals who are in a position where they have a lot of senior citizens, or maybe not a majority of senior citizens in their district, but if they have a vocal minority of senior citizens, that congressman is probably unlikely to vote for any measure that's going to reduce current benefits to retirees. Now, the Republican Party, led by Paul Ryan, they introduced some reform that was never passed through to become a law, that basically aimed to reduce benefits to future retirees, those that are currently under 55. But again, not a lot of political momentum was gained from that. So again, interest groups such as the AARP, formerly called the Association for Retired People, but now just called the AARP, they exert strong influence on legislators who basically run for re-election every 2 years. So again, just because of a lot of political pressures and just the reality that senior citizens, they stand to benefit from the status quo, they're going to vigorously and vociferously oppose any measure that reduces their current benefits. And you can make a compelling argument that there's nothing wrong with going for your own self-interest. Now, the third possibility of raising the retirement age, again, given the three possible public policy options, probably is the most the easiest pill to swallow. Again, not something that's completely pleasant, but again, the idea of simply raising the retirement age, what you're doing is you are protecting those that are currently drawing from Social Security, and again, delaying payments in the future. So don't be surprised if politicians, in order to try to solve the Social Security crisis, lean towards raising the retirement age, because while it might be unpopular, it appears to be the option that generates the least amount of opposition. Again, to give you an idea, there's already been a trend towards raising the retirement age. Currently, the full retirement age for those born between 1943 and 1954 is actually 66. Now, those born after 1960, full retirement is now age 67. Now, will Congress continue that trend where maybe those born after 1970, it's going to be 70 years old and 75? The problem, again, with Social Security, when it was originally passed in the 30s, Social Security was based on a lifespan of maybe 70, 75 years. Individuals retiring at age 65 and drawing Social Security from between 5 to 10 years. Now you have Social Security, people are retiring at age maybe 62, or again, waiting to get more benefits at the full retirement age of 66. And people are living longer. They're living until 102 years old. So it is quite possible that Social Security will have made, payments of 40 years, possibly 30 years. And again, while that's great on one hand, there's an idea that it's putting a strain on our financial resources. So in terms of the federal budget, in terms of money and enacting bills that require the use of money, the fiscal year actually for the federal government begins October 1st and runs to September 30th. Now, how it works from the president's perspective, the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, they work with the president's staff to combine department requests that they get from cabinet members, and they basically put into budget package to Congress. And usually the president emphasizes the proposals that he's recommending at the State of the Union address, or sometime near that time. But basically the president is the legislative leader, even though he technically is not part of the legislative branch. The president is informally required to set the legislative agenda. And sometimes, depending on the style of the president can be very hands-on or a little bit more hands-off in terms of how to actually implement public policy. So Congress basically debates with the Congressional Budget Office, providing economic data, while Congress holds committee hearings and analyzes budget proposal. So again, Congress, you're going to have opposing sides, and they're going to use data given by the CBO to try to strengthen their argument. So the CBO is supposedly a more neutral organization, but again, congressmen from both sides of the aisle can kind of cherry pick certain facts to try to strengthen their particular argument. And again, what ends up happening is Congress sends appropriation bills for approval, because we know the Appropriations Committee, one of the three exclusive committees, the other two being the Rules Committee and the Ways and Means Committee. But appropriations, they're basically the ones that determine funding for the bill. And the problem that occurs, and it's actually happened, or the threat of it happening has actually happened numerous times in the Obama administration. If no budget is approved, then Congress is responsible for passing temporary emergency funding, or the government will shut down. So a lot of the discretionary funding expenditures will actually just shut down. National parks will be closed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, they will close. A lot of the IRS will close down. So during government shutdown, if you actually call some of these agencies, I actually did so myself during the last government shutdown. I actually called the IRS, and the IRS basically, you got an answering machine message saying that the IRS had shut down, and so there was no one available to take the call. So again, we have a system for how to fund government, and if the funding for government isn't there, then there's no money to pay non-essential workers, and so you have what's termed to be a government shutdown. So example number 1, who is actually in charge of fiscal policy in the United States? Is it only Congress? No. Is it only the president? No. Is it only the Supreme Court? Well, that's not true at all. Is it Congress and the president? That is absolutely true. So again, the legislative process, Congress is the one that's in charge of creating the law, and the president can either sign it or veto it. And it's not Congress, the president, and the Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court, maybe you can argue that they're indirectly involved, but no, they're the ones that determine the constitutionality of measures. And again, one of the measures that the Supreme Court actually did rule on was with Obamacare, striking down Congress's ability to enact health care under necessary and proper clause or commerce clause, but rather granting them the ability to issue the individual mandates under the power to tax ability found in the Constitution. Okay, question number 2. Which of the following is considered part of discretionary expenditures? Okay, which of the following is considered interest on national debt? Absolutely not. That is not part of discretionary. It is mandatory. Defense spending, it is discretionary. Social Security payments, it is not. So 1 and 3 are actually incorrect. So the correct answer is 2 only. Okay, question number 3. Which of the following is not considered a way to reform Social Security to make it solvent in the decades to come? And again, there are a lot of different ways to do that. I mentioned a couple that are possible ways to reform Social Security. What is not one of the methods? Raise FICA taxes, which stands for Federal Insurance Contributions Act, which is basically another way of saying Social Security tax. To raise FICA taxes from its current 12.4% rate. That is possible, so this is not a correct answer. Reduce the amount of benefits to current retirees. Again, that would be very unpopular, but again, it is a possible way to deal with Social Security. C, reduce the amount of benefits to future retirees currently under 55 years old. Again, that's one way to bring about long-term solvency of the program. Raise the age limit of those eligible to receive Social Security payments. Again, that's something that already has been put into place. For you guys watching, it's probably going to be the case where you're not going to be able to draw Social Security until you're 67, maybe 70 or 75 even. E, lower the age limit to those eligible to receive Social Security payments to 59.5. And that's the correct answer. If you lower the age limit, then you're going to magnify your problems and you're gonna be in a worse situation. So again, there's no guarantees that the Congress isn't going to lower the age, but given the fiscal problems that Congress has in terms of funding Social Security, it is highly unlikely the government will actually reduce the age. Now, the reason why I put 59.5, there's actually an account in which individuals who don't make a lot of money, they can open up. It's called the Roth IRA, and 59.5 is the age in which you can start withdrawing money from a Roth IRA without incurring any type of penalty. Example number 4. Under what authority was Congress given the right to mandate health insurance coverage for all Americans? And again, this was a decision that came out by the Supreme Court in 2012. And they ruled that it wasn't through the necessary and proper clause. It wasn't through the commerce clause. There's no mention of the due process clause. And there's no such thing as the health insurance mandate clause. There's nothing written in the Constitution that directly enables Congress to mandate health coverage. Again, if you look at the intention of the Founding Fathers, you'd be hard-pressed to argue that they felt that this is something that the federal government should have jurisdiction over. That being said, under the John Roberts Supreme Court, he and 4 of the liberal justices, they argued that yes, Congress does have the right to issue an individual mandate because if you choose not to get health insurance, it's not a penalty that you're imposing. Rather, it's a tax that's being levied on those that choose not to get health insurance. So under authority for the power to tax that's given to Congress under the Constitution was the route that Obamacare became constitutional. And finally, example number 5. What government agency is responsible for helping the president craft the budget that eventually will be submitted to Congress? So let's take a look at some of these agencies and determine if they're the agency that basically compiles a bunch of priorities of what the president is going to spend money on. And is it the FBI? No, it's not the FBI. The FBI is in charge of a lot of domestic surveillance, a lot of things that deal with crime prevention and high-level crime. The CBO, no, they're the arm of Congress that provides a lot of financial data to congressmen who tend to be more generalists. The IMF, that's an International Monetary Fund. They're like the firemen of the international community, financial community. If there's a loan issue with a country, then the IMF usually comes in and provides emergency loans to struggling countries. Is it the OMB? And absolutely. And what does the OMB stand for? It's Office of Management and Budget. So again, they work closely with the White House staff to create a budget that highlights the priorities of the president. Again, it would be impossible for the president to micromanage everything to the detail. And that's where the OMB comes in. And they work with the president's staff to get a budget prepared and fully submitted for approval eventually. Or is it the OMG? There is definitely no OMG government agency. Thank you for watching educator.com.